Hello, hello. Welcome back to Bookcasting. We have a very interesting topic to talk about. I'm going to talk about the woke shtick, but not the way you think. You see, people have been gravely mistaken when it comes to the woke disease, if you will, that's been spreading pop culture of late. They think this is a sort of new phenomenon that hasn't existed before, and that is gravely mistaken. Before the woke plague that took over film and comic books and any other thing you can think of in pop culture, before it took over any of the recognizable IPs, it took over the arts decades and decades and decades, nearly a century ago. And it all started back with this. This piece, if you can call it that, is a part of an art movement that happened about around the after World War I during the early 20s, essentially. It's called Dada. Just Dada. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's D-A-D-A. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the beginning of the woke virus. Way back when in the 20s. You see, what started to happen with Dada is that it became less and less focused on the arts and basically more of a way of stripping arts from the art itself, and while making excuse of like, oh, but what is art? Like, a toilet can be art as long as we put in an exhibit. My ass can be an art as long as I can put it in an exhibit. A baby's uterus could be a piece of art if it's put in an exhibit. Yeah, Dada started that trend. Dada was the first movement to entirely focus on mostly being political activism and stupid stunts than actually creating any works of art. Gee, does that sound familiar? It sure should as well, because that's what's been happening of late. And of course, just like in the case of Dada, most of this inevitably got its roots back into the universities, or started around the universities in this case, and it's started to set a standard. Just to give you an example of the stunts they used to pull, here's a stunt, basically a stupid stunt, sort of mocking the Pope and the Catholic Church at that time by like quoting some silly phrases like "oh, you know, stuff like that, and going like, "Aha, it's art because I dressed like a silly person and said some silly words, meaningless words." And yeah, the only positive thing about Dada that I can honestly think of is probably its influence on helping create collage, and that's about it. Everything else was more obsessed with politics than anything else, especially the politics of the day, more obsessed with making stupid stunts than actually creating any works of art, and most importantly, what this did was cause an alienation with the arts. And this is where really we get to the postmodernism, a late 20th century style and concept in the arts, architecture, and criticism that represents a departure from modernism and has its heart general distrust of grand theories, ideologies, as well as problematic relationships between the notion of art, etc., etc. So, it's kind of like this. What happened with the most of the arts was kind of the same thing, whether it was painting or poetry or sculpture. What happened was you had a sort of artistic traditional norm that everyone understood and shared for quite a while. But that artistic traditional norm started to become a bit dull, started to become a bit stagnant. The artists started to get bored, and so they started to experiment and find new ways of expressing art. And these new ways of expressing art, in the beginning, were quite good. And it led to a big boom in more experimentation within art. But as these experimentations kept coming about, it started to simplify and simplify. Now, at first, this wasn't a bad thing, because although it was simple, there was really some obvious artistry put in there. You know, you could say something like, well, Picasso's paintings might be simple, or Matisse's paintings might be simple, but the way they were able to express things, and the way they were able to use the lines, and the coloring that was used, and etc., still had a good impact, and there was still a clear expression there that's very impactful for those that are into that sort of thing. But what happened is, this simplicity that started to come into the arts, it opened the doorway, if you will, for anyone to come in. And then you had these people that came into the art world that had no artistic skill or talent at all, and didn't want to have any artistic skill or talent at all. And so they basically hijacked these arts and promoted their type of art, non-art, as art, because it fits with their little to no artistic skill. That is, yeah, if that doesn't sound exactly like wokeism, well, exactly, that's what happened. This is what happened to painting. This is what happened to sculpture. This is definitely what happened to architecture. This is definitely what happened to poetry. All of these artistic art forms, even the more, like, how do I put it, the more traditional novel, the like a literary novel. That's what I was trying to say. The literary novel, even that eventually got plagued with this sort of thing, and this postmodernist sort of crap, the pre-wokeism, if you will, basically just wokeism of its day, started to take place. But unfortunately, what happened was the general public ignored it. They didn't take any notice of it because, well, the arts became less and less willing to actually make anything that the general public would have any interest or investment in. So nobody really cared about it. The art world just became a means of funneling money for rich people, essentially. And the general public became less and less interested in the arts in general, especially in terms of painting and architecture and stuff like that. Poetry is essentially in a dead art. Hardly anyone can write good poetry, and even if anyone could write good poetry, you could hardly sell it because no one is really interested in reading it. And not only that, the poetry, much like everything else, is stuck in the stupid political echo chamber where there's more focus and attention towards stating a certain political byline through a university than actually creating any genuine work of art to express any sort of emotion to any wider audience at all. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why the woke disease is not new. The woke disease is quite old. It's been constantly coming at us over and over and over again ever since they first got their way into the art world. Way back in the 20s with Dada. Dada started all this shit. And the universities that started to become more focused towards, a postmodernist view, breaking away from tradition. You always hear the demonizing, nowadays at least, you always hear the demonizing of art, traditional artistry, especially in terms of like representation of religion. Oh, the representation of religion was just propaganda tools. Haha. Yeah, because the arts today would never be used as a political propaganda tool in the same way that you criticize it being so back in the day. Sure. But the other thing I think people often forget and ignore is this. The thing about back in the day is that whether it was religious arts or not, the artists were generally expressing mythologies and stories. So it was much more than just a propaganda tool, although it could be used for a propaganda tool. In fact, really the most only obvious examples of propaganda tools you could honestly say back in the day was the constant paintings of the kings and so forth. And even to that extent, it's not like it's changed much. You still get a lot of the big portraiture of the famous people that are super uber expensive, valuable, important people, apparently. So it's not like this is anything new. And also, I think the most greatest irony is that the art world acts like they're against any traditional norms, at least the art establishment, I should say. The art establishment, goes on to act like, well, we're against any artistic traditions or norms, yet they've been repeating the same stupid traditional shit for decades upon decades upon decades. If they're not repeating traditional shit in the context of Dada with stupid stunts and pranks like this, they're either doing some form of exhibitationalism, constantly, focusing more on being famous and stuff like that, as well as just exhibiting something for the sake of exhibition and instead of creating a work of art, which leads into one of the other things they're obviously focused on in the art established art world, some form of pop art, as usual, and then some form of abstract expressionism, and then some form of minimalism, some variations thereupon. Now, I'm not saying all postmodern art is bad, because every once in a while you do have a surprisingly good piece of postmodern art here and there, but there is so much more shit today than there was before. And don't give me that age-old excuse that you always try and use. Well, you're cherry picking. In the past there was bad artists. No, no, no. Don't you dare go there. Okay, the amount of skill, effort, and time it took to be a professional artist in the old days meant that you had to be at least, you had to be at least, you know, you have to at least be comprehensive in your work. You couldn't be you couldn't be a hack job back in those days, because it required too much effort, essentially, and training to actually be good enough artist to make any amount of money. You couldn't half-ass it, not nearly as much as you can now. And it is honestly, unfortunately, because you look at the earlier modernism stuff, Cubism from Picasso, for example, or Surrealism, Salvador Dali, etc. That's still really good art, still holds up now. And every once in a while, you can get an echo of that sort of art even to this day. But it doesn't change the fact that the majority arts is more of stunts and whatnot. And that's the great irony. Like, the art world acts like, well, we're against traditional norms, and yet almost everything they do is influenced by data, or it's influenced by abstract expressionism, or it's influenced by pop art, and repeating the same sorts of things. And the same limited palette, too. It hardly ever expands past that. And even when it does expand past that, it's just reaching back into some form of modernist art, like I mentioned earlier with Cubism and stuff like that. And even then, none of it's as good as the earlier stuff that was used. So I just thought I should mention this, because the saddest thing is the general public has no understanding or realization that this woke disease goes way back, because the majority of the general public is so alienated from poetry, from painting, and from architecture, and from sculpture, because this sort of stupid shit just alienated the general public from this, and it made the majority of the general public just want to have nothing to do with it more and more, regardless of a person's beliefs or opinions. It's just the truth of the matter. Everyone would be interested in a painting looking at a painting of Van Gogh. No one would be interested in looking at the majority of paintings or sculptures today. There's maybe a few exceptions of popular artists, but I think the best example of this is look at what's actually popular for the general public today. Either it's those virtual, like the all screen shows of art, of someone's artworks, like those Van Gogh virtual exhibit kind of things. That's one of the things that's always popular. Or it's one of the selfie zones, right? It's less about the art and more about the person in the art taking a picture of themselves at the place than it is about the art itself, right? And that's, to constantly just make a prop set for someone to make a selfie and call that a day as an artwork is pretty pathetic, honestly. And it just ruins so much of the meaning of art in terms of its ability to express thoughts, its ability to express emotions, its ability to express ideas and convey them through images, through colors and patterns, the form of the human body, etc. Sorry I rambled, but yeah, I just want to point this out to the general public at large. The woke disease is not new. The woke disease is quite old, and it may finally die down for a bit, but it's probably going to come back at some point. I just think it's a shame that at the end of the day, although we recognize how bad the woke disease is now, and although the majority of people are trying to fight back against the woke disease, they're only going to fight back to try and restore the sort of conventional pop cultural stuff that existed decades ago, which, for the record, I have nothing against any of that stuff at all, okay? I've been a genuine Star Wars fan since I was a kid. I grew up watching the prequels onwards, so I've always been a fan of that. And I have nothing against it. I just think it's a shame that, the general audience perception is so limited. They don't realize that the issues that they're complaining about now with pop art, or with with pop culture. That's what I meant to say. Is not new. The same issue plagued the rest of the arts for ages. It alienated the general public from all these other great art forms that the general public has little to no interest in. No one cares about reading poetry for the most part, other than poets, or very limited people that actually care about reading, interest in poetry at all. But it's a very small number. Anyways, I'm sorry for rambling. I just thought I'd point this out because it's important people understand the context. I'm afraid people are so accustomed to thinking this is just a new thing when it's not. And it's not. Anyways, that's all for today, tonight, what have you. Have a good day. Goodbye.